Hello, and welcome to Topic 1 lecture. And in this lecture, we're going to be taking a look at important terms for gender studies. In this lecture, we're going to do a quick primer on terms we'll be using throughout the course of the semester. Some of these terms you may already be familiar with, but it's important that these terms are properly defined so that they're used in the correct manner. The terms that we're going to be defining in this lecture are biological sex, gender or gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It is not uncommon for people to confuse sex and gender. They're often used interchangeably in everyday conversation, but they're actually very different things, and it's very important, particularly for a gender studies course, to know these differences so that these terms can be used in the correct way. So, what is sex? Well, the word sex has two meanings. Sex can refer to intercourse and other types of sexual intimacy. Another definition of sex refers to a classification based on biology. A person's sex is their classification that they're given at birth, male, female, or intersex, depending on their chromosomes, XX, XY, their reproductive organs, ovaries, testes, penises, vaginas, and other characteristics. Biological sex is in many ways a label. It's a category one is assigned at birth by a doctor or a midwife. In many ways, it's a box that is checked just so that we know how to categorize humans. Now, most people are born with corresponding sets of anatomy. For instance, they're born with penis and testicle, or they're born with ovaries, a uterus, and a vagina, right? And so if you're born with a penis and testicles, you're going to be assigned male at birth. Born with a vagina and ovaries, you're going to be assigned female at birth. But some people are not born with corresponding sets of anatomy. People can be born with both ovaries and testicular tissue. They can be born with both a penis and a vagina, for example. And when people are born without corresponding sets of anatomy, then the category that they are assigned is intersex. Now, not long ago, when a child was born intersex, doctors would force parents to pick either male or female as the sex label. And oftentimes surgery was performed to normalize their genitals. But thankfully, we're moving away from such harmful practices, with some states actually outlawing these sorts of procedures. Let's now explore the meaning of gender identity. Before we can define gender identity, we need to first understand what is meant by identity. Broadly defined, identity is one's sense of self, your personal identity. And there are different ways of thinking about the concept of identity. One way of thinking about it is through the lens of psychology. From this perspective, an individual's sense of who they are, their sense of self, is derived from their physical, psychological, and interpersonal characteristics. For example, a person's sense of self might be derived from the fact that they feel that they're an optimistic, energetic, hardworking person that values friendship and loyalty. Identity is also influenced by affiliations such as one's race, ethnicity, or religion. And identity is also a product of social roles and influenced by social roles, the roles that you play within society, such as whether you're a parent, your profession, your leadership role in your community, etc. Gender identity is an important aspect of one's general sense of self. Gender identity is one's psychological or personal sense of self as it relates to gender. So your personal sense of self as being a man, being a woman, being transgender. It's one's internal, deeply held sense of gender. Now, when it comes to gender identity, some folks identify very closely with the gender that's associated with their sex classification, okay? And so if you are assigned at birth as female, the gender closely associated with that is woman, okay? And so if you're assigned female at birth and you have a sense of identity of being a woman, then that's oftentimes referred to as being cisgender. Other folks may identify only as part of a gender, or with both genders, or with no gender at all. And this is referred to it by several different terms. One of which is gender non-binary, right? It's sort of like that for you, there's no one gender that you identify with. It can also be referred to as gender fluid, gender queer. And some people identify with a gender that's not associated with their sex assigned at birth. And this is what is referred to as transgender. So you're assigned male at birth, but you don't identify with being a man. You identify with being a woman. And so that it falls in the category of transgender. Now, I want you to keep in mind like with other aspects of identity, gender identity it's not visible to others. You can make it visible to others if you tell somebody what your gender identity is, right? But for the most sense, it's like one sense of what it means to be a man, woman, trans. It's personal and it's often private. Plus, there's no set way to feel like a woman or feel like a man. Like all aspects of personal identity, it's up to the individual to define this for themselves. So gender expression is how a person expresses their gender identity. So while gender identity is a personal sense of oneself, gender expression is the way you portray or manifest that sense of self to the world. Now, there are many different ways that people express their gender identity. Names and pronouns are written and verbal means of expressing gender identity. Clothing, the clothes you wear, haircuts, your physical behaviors are more visual ways that you express your gender identity, and voices are oral manifestations of that. Now, sometimes gender expression conforms to social expectations that revolve around gender, in particular, social conceptualizations of masculinity and femininity, right? So, for example, from a social norms, men are supposed to act masculine. And there's an expectation of what masculine expression is, right? Men don't cry, they dress in neutral colors, they have beards and muscles. They have deep, steady voices, right? But oftentimes, and particularly as social expectations around gender change, oftentimes gender expression do not correspond with social expectations regarding masculinity and femininity. And so we have two pictures of two folks who express their gender in different ways. On the top is Asia Kate Dillon. They're gender non-binary. They star in TV series Billions and Orange is the New Black. And that you can see Asia Kate Dillon's expression of their gender identity as gender non-binary. On the bottom is Serena Williams. Her gender identity is a woman, and this is how she chooses to express that gender identity. Serena Williams, I think, as we all know, is one of the greatest tennis players of all times. And in many ways, she has redefined how gender is expressed in women's tennis. This brings us to our last term that we'll be defining in lecture, and that is sexual orientation. Now, at the beginning of the lecture, we discussed how sex has two meanings. Sexual orientation deals with the first definition of sex as it relates to sexual intercourse and other types of sexual intimacy. So sexual orientation is one's desire for emotional, romantic, or sexual relationships. This desire is sometimes based on the sex, gender, or gender expression of other people, but not always. Gay, lesbian, straight, bisexual, asexual, pansexual are all terms that are used to identify sexual orientation. All right, so let's do a knowledge check. So I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios, and I want you to tell me which of the concepts this scenario relates to. So the first scenario is I need to go to Planned Parenthood to get a pap smear, and a pap smear is a screening for cervical cancer. Does this scenario deal with biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation? If you said biological sex, you are correct. I want you to keep it, so cervical cervix are connected to the uterus, part of the uterus, and that whether or not you have a uterus is relates to your biological sex. I do want you to keep in mind that gender identity is separate from biological sex. We know that. What that means is that when it comes to healthcare, trans men may very well need pap smears and other healthcare that's associated with biological sex, and the same with trans women. So keep that in mind. Here's the second scenario. Oh, that person is so hot, they make my heart race. I want to kiss them. If you guessed sexual orientation, you are correct. I don't feel like a man. I don't feel like a woman. I feel somewhere in between. Is this biological sex, gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation? If you said gender identity, that is correct. And then finally, my preferred pronouns are she, her, and hers. And that is gender expression. And no lecture on important terms for a gender studies class would be complete without taking a look at the genderbread person. Get it? Not gingerbread, but genderbread. I'm sure many of you have seen this before, but it's just a nice way of sort of remembering what we learned. That gender identity is a psychological feeling. That sexual orientation is the attraction that you have in your heart. Your biological sex has to do with your sex parts and other physical manifestations, and how you show the world your gender identity is that gender expression. All right, thanks for your time, and I will talk to you again soon.